When I was in college, I got a C in freshman composition.
Freshman composition. So
No one predicted I would be a bestseller.
so you're not a
author.
writer then. Yeah.
Well, I guess I became one.
Yeah. You learned. Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Was this always something that was on your heart growing up? Like, I know that you said that your dad and your parents, your stepdad growing up had limiting beliefs about money
Right.
and different things like that. So were those programmed into your brain? Did you have to do a lot of mental reprogramming?
I did. I grew up kind of in the hippie period of the 60s, and I was like against big business, and people that have money must have screwed somebody to get it kind of mentality. Yeah. And I met W. Clement Stone when I was in Chicago in graduate school. And he wrote a book called The Success System Never Fails. He was good friends with Napoleon Hill, who wrote Think and Grow Rich. And I started studying with him, weekend workshops and so forth, and totally changed my mind. I never forget him saying, success is not a 4-letter word, meaning it's not a bad thing. Yeah. And the more money you have, the more good you can do. One of Bob Proctor's great quotes is, if you don't have money, the good you can do is limited to your physical presence. If you have money, you can do good all over the world. And so I began to realize, and I grew up in a middle class world where I thought, if I just go to college and get a job, I'll be a good guy. And when I got to college, I got involved in a civil rights movement. I started to wake up in terms of liberation and fairness, and everyone should have a shot at success. Yeah. And I began to realize, wow, I would like to have all that as well. Live in a big house and have a nice car and have money to travel and do education and take care of my family.
So you initially started as an educator, right?
Yes.
So you weren't planning on going to some big university, but then all of a sudden you had a teacher that pushed you. Can you talk us through like how that?
Yeah, I was going to this school in West Virginia, which is not known for its education systems, and my Latin teacher decided I was maybe more gifted than a lot of kids, and she said to me one day, where are you going to apply to college? I said, I don't know, Ohio State, West Virginia University. She says, well, I can get you into West Virginia University with a letter, because she was well known in that world. And she said, you need to apply to some Ivy League schools. And I thought, you're crazy, And but I applied to Harvard, Yale, and Brown, and also just believed she could get me into West Virginia. I got into all three, which was surprising to me. And I also got an appointment to West Point and Annapolis, which I decided not to do. But I ended up at Harvard, and majored in Chinese history, which has nothing to do with what I do today.
Chinese history.
It just proves I can study hard on things that are challenging and persevere.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So during that time, what was like the biggest deciding factor for you? Like, why Harvard? Well, was there anything that stood out?
This is embarrassing, but what stood out for me was there were about 25 girls' schools within 15 miles.
There you go.
And I had gone to an all-boys school all through
Nothing
high
embarrassing
school.
about that. Yeah.
And I just thought, it's a big city. It's near Boston. It's not isolated. And everyone always just said Harvard was the kind of, pinnacle of the whole thing. So why not?
Cool. So in Harvard, you major in Chinese history. Then what happens after that?
My senior year, my roommate took a course called Soc Rel 10, Social Relations 10. And then he took another course in psych. And he said, these are really cool. You should take them. So I took this course. It turned out to be what we called back then an encounter group. We just sat around and talked about our feelings and learned about relationships. And I had none of that. I mean, I grew up in a family that was didn't talk about their feelings, in an all-boys school where you had to be macho. And then you go to Harvard, it's an all-boys school back then. You had to be macho. And this was like new, but I woke up. It was like, I want to do this. I want to help people discover who they really are, develop their human potential. And with a degree in Chinese history, that wasn't really easy to get into graduate school. So my advisor said, well, why don't you go into education as if you're going to teach history. And then while you're in graduate school in education, you can take ed psych and psych courses. And that's what I did. Okay. And I taught in an all-black inner city school for a year. And what I discovered, I became more interested in motivating my students than I was in teaching history. And that's when I discovered there was this guy named W. Clement Stone who had a foundation where they were teaching people how to help kids achieve more through psychology.
So more heart knowledge than head knowledge, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, the head's involved, but the heart is more important, absolutely. Yeah. And we need both, heart and head. And when those are integrated, then you have people that are really functioning at a high level.
So then you go to this foundation, and the guy that's running this basically becomes your first mentor, right?
Correct.
Okay. And What kind of relationship did you like? Was it pretty formal in the fact that like you sat down with him and you'd go over goals and stuff like that, or was it just kind of like?
I didn't spend all that much time with him. I did spend some time with him, but most of the time I spent with the guy that he put in charge of his foundation, a guy named Dr. Billy Sharp, who was a real genius. And then there were 3 other people, all PhD psychologists who were really bright. And they just took me under their wing and just mentored me. Yeah. And then I got time with Stone as well. I'll never forget probably the most profound conversation we had. We were literally from the elevator at the top of the building down to the first floor.
Okay.
And I said, Mr. Stone, I'm fairly radical, leftist Democrat, and you're a totally conservative right Republican, and yet we get along really well. Why? And he said, he drew 2 circles, and two circles where there's a little bit of overlap like this. Mm-hmm. And he said, we don't agree on this, and we don't agree on that. But we both agree that we need to be educating people in the inner city and empowering them to get out of the ghetto and blah, 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 blah. So all I want to do is spend my time with you on that. There's no reason to talk about anything else. And that really transformed the way I look at people that don't agree with everything I do. Well, what can we agree on and what can we get done? And let's not waste our time.
Yeah.
That was profound. And then his other thing was he just taught me goal setting, values, visualization, affirmation, perseverance, and do it now. He came up with do it now way before Nike did.
Way before Nike.
Yeah.
And just for some context here for somebody watching or listening that may not know who that is, can you give a little bit of context?
Sure. He was a guy who did not go to college. He later got a college degree after he became wealthy. He just wanted to complete that for himself. But he sold newspapers on the street. He was really, really poor. He took a job as a salesperson in an insurance company. He just rocked the world. He just knew how to sell, and he studied it. And so eventually he started his own insurance company, Combined Insurance, and he then was the publisher of Success Magazine, which is now the big, used to be a small, like Reader's Digest size. Okay. He published that. He had a company called Hawthorne Publishing, where he did publish all these books. The guy that wrote The Greatest Salesman That Ever Lived, Og Mandino, was the editor of the Success Magazine, worked in the same building I did. So I would go up in the evenings because Og burned the midnight oil, and so did I. I got mentored by him. That was incredible. Awesome. So I was just surrounded by these gurus of positive belief and take action and anything's possible. And it was very, very cool. This guy was worth $600 million in the 1970s, so he would have been a billionaire by today's inflationary standards.
For sure. We're going to touch on some of that stuff a little bit later. I kind of want to continue along the whole life story thing because there's so much networking little things that you're just talking about as far as mentorship and stuff like that goes. But so now moving along from here, you are teaching in the inner city, and then did you get a job at a college or something as a professor after that?
Well, what happened? I worked at that school. Then this professor from Harvard started a program at a ex-VA hospital that turned into what was called a Job Corps Center, where kids who had dropped out of school ended up getting job training. Okay. And so I was there, part of like a 4-person Young Turks out of education schools team. We were doing radical stuff. We were the first people to create individualized learning. We actually took the Sullivan reading program where you go, A sounds like apple or grape, and we put the instruction, which the teacher does, on tape recorders so every kid could move at their own pace. And now everyone does that in their computers. We were the first guys to do that. So then I went from there back to Chicago for a year, worked at the Stone Foundation some more, and then I went to the University of Massachusetts. There was a professor I met at the conference who said, we would love to have you in graduate school. I said, I don't want to pay that money right now. He said, we'll give you a full scholarship. Gave me a full scholarship, made me a teaching assistant, so I taught for a while. Then I had a teaching job at Hampshire College, which is also in Amherst, Massachusetts. So I was at University of Mass in Amherst. And then I'm at my doctorate level, and I just got arrogant. Like, I don't need the damn PhD. I wrote a book by then called 100 Ways to Enhance Self-Concept in the Classroom. I was getting consulting jobs back then at $300 a day, which was a lot.
I was going to say, so that book that you wrote at that time, sold a lot of copies.
400,000 copies.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it changed my whole perception of who I was, what could be done with a book. And I started
one of those big goals that you always talk about. Yeah. Right? Like one of the life marker goals.
Yeah. And I had this professor who was a best-selling author named Sid Simon, and I said, I want to grow up and be like you. He said, well, here's how I did it. And so one of the things I teach if you're networking and mentoring is like, ask people that have done what you want to do how they did it. Keith Ferrazzi wrote a book called Never Eat Alone. And so it's like every meal you could invite someone to join you, or you could have lunch with them, or you could go for a walk. Because I used to go with this professor. He was a hiker. And just ask questions. And you'd be surprised how many people will say yes. But anyway, so it sold 400,000 copies. So I left school and I started a growth center. It's a place where people go for weekend workshops. And we had 11 acres of land just right outside of Amherst. And we put on about 40 weekend workshops a year, most of which I took if I wasn't leading them. Okay. And so I got just like about a 10-year education that was insane.
So you were hosting them, right, but participating in them.
Right. Because I spent all my money taking workshops at other centers. I ran out of money. I said, the only way I can do this is if I bring people in. Yeah. And it started in the Holiday Inn because that's all I could afford. And then I eventually got married and we bought a house that had a 30 by 30 living room. We could run workshops in it. Okay. And it just evolved out of that.
It says so much, though, just about resourcefulness, just in and of itself, because a lot of people would just run out of money and then just be like, all right, well, that was fun. Right. and then it's done, But you, instead of doing that, were like, I love doing this. I want to continue to learn about this, and this. But I don't have the money to do it right now. So I'll just host them and then be a part of them.
Or the other
learn
thing,
for free.
The other thing you can do is so many people now run seminars. They need assistants, people to hand out the Kleenex, to register people at the door, to hand out the crayons, whatever it is. And so I did some of that along the way as well.
Yeah, really cool, really cool. So now you have an actual education company, basically, right, where you're running these workshops and everything like that. At what point does the Chicken Soup for the Soul come out of this whole thing?
I was running around doing the workshops, but also doing a lot of speaking. Okay. And I learned in my inner city classrooms that the only time the kids really paid attention was when I was telling a story. If I was telling a historical fact or the 5 causes of the Civil War or whatever, they're like zoned out. Yeah, totally. But if I would tell a story about an escaped slave, or if I'd tell a story, and I began to realize these kids didn't believe they could be successful. So I started reading Jet and Ebony magazine and looking for stories of African Americans who'd made it, who were corporate people, successful lawyers, whatever. And I would bring those to school and I'd read them to them. I'd put them on the bulletin board. And they were like, whoa, someone like me did that? Yeah. And so I saw the power of stories. So I just started collecting inspirational, motivational stories. And as I was doing my seminars after I'd started, the company called Self-Esteem Seminars, that became the Canfield Training Group now, I would tell these stories to inspire people. And people would come up and say, that's a story about the Girl Scout who sold 3,000 boxes of Girl Scout cookies. Is that in a book anywhere? My daughter needs to read it. A story about the guy who climbed Mount Everest who was blind. Is that in a book anywhere? And I go, no. And one day it was like God was knocking me on the head saying, hey, put those stories in a book. How many times do I have to have people ask you this question? So I literally, on the plane coming back from Boston to LA at the time, I wrote down every story I knew. It came out to 70 stories. Wow. And so I said, I'm going to write a story, 2 stories a week, and within a year I'll have a book. And that's what happened. Then toward the end of that, I met Mark Victor Hansen at a breakfast, and he asked me what I was doing, what I was excited about, and I told him. He said, I want to do that with you. And I said, Mark, that's like telling, James Michener, he's 3/4 done with the book Hawaii, and you want to finish it with him. Why would he let you do that? And he said, well, first of all, you took a lot of stories that are mine and you use them. And secondly, he said, I got a lot of stories you never heard. And he said, you need 101 stories. That's a spiritual number. He had done an internship in India when he was in college. Okay. So I said, well, if you can find 31 stories, we'll do it. And he did. And it was a great match because he's much more of a marketer, promoter than I was at the time. And I was much more of a detail guy. So it became a great marriage for the time we did it.